In the early morning light, the sky above Europe looked calm. Soft clouds drifted slowly, painted with gentle shades of gold and gray. At first glance, it seemed like any other quiet morning during the long years of war. But hidden inside that peaceful sky was a tension that could almost be felt on the skin. Something important was about to happen. Something that would change the course of a battlefield and perhaps even the direction of the war itself. Far below, the ground still remembered the sound of tanks that had passed through the night before. Heavy tracks crushed the earth, leaving scars deep in the soil. The smell of smoke hung lightly in the air, mixed with dust, oil, and the cold breath of early dawn. Villages sat silent, their windows broken, their walls cracked, as if waiting to see what the day would bring. High above this world of fear and waiting, 6 P-47 Thunderbolts stood ready on a simple airstrip. Their metal bodies were cold and silent, like sleeping giants waiting to wake. The ground crews moved quietly around them, checking fuel lines, tightening bolts, loading ammunition into the heavy wings. Thick belts of bullets fed into the guns, each round a tiny piece of the storm these aircraft could unleash. The pilots walked toward their planes with steady steps. They were young, many barely in their 20s, yet they carried the weight of huge responsibility on their shoulders. Some tried to hide their nerves with small smiles. Others stayed silent, lost in their own thoughts. None of them spoke loudly. In moments like these, the world felt strangely fragile, as if loud voices might cause something to break before the mission even began. A light wind passed through the airfield, brushing against uniforms and rattling loose sheets of metal. One of the pilots paused for a moment and looked at the horizon. He saw nothing unusual, just a calm sky and distant hills. But somewhere out there, beyond what the eye could see, dozens of German tanks were moving. They were strong, heavily armored, and feared by soldiers across Europe. These tanks had crushed villages, pushed back entire divisions, and created terror wherever they advanced. And today those tanks were the target. The pilots knew this mission was different. They had seen the briefing. They had understood the danger. 6 Thunderbolts against a full armored column. It sounded almost impossible. The numbers did not make sense. The odds were not in their favor. Yet here they were, preparing to fly. One pilot took a deep breath. Another adjusted his gloves. A third touched the side of his aircraft gently, as if greeting an old friend. These planes were more than machines. They were lifelines, protectors, and sometimes the only thing standing between life and death. The engines started one by one, sending powerful vibrations through the ground. The deep, heavy roar rose into the air, breaking the silence of the morning. Birds scattered from the nearby trees. Dust lifted off the runway. The smell of burning fuel mixed with the cold wind. The P-47s were waking up. As the engines warmed, the pilots climbed into their cockpits. They strapped themselves in, checked their instruments, and tested the controls. Their hands moved with practiced skill, but inside, their hearts beat a little faster. Every flight carried risk. But this one carried something more. A sense of fate, perhaps. A sense that whatever happened today would be remembered. The squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio, calm but firm. It was the kind of voice that carried strength without needing to shout. The pilots listened closely. They trusted him. They trusted each other. Trust was the only way missions like this could succeed. When the order came to take off, there was no hesitation. One by one, the Thunderbolts rolled down the runway, picking up speed as their engines roared louder and louder. The wheels lifted from the ground, and the massive planes rose into the sky, climbing steadily through the early morning light. From above, the world looked different. The scars of war blended with the natural beauty of forests and rivers. Smoke curled upward from distant battlefields. Roads twisted like ribbons across the landscape. And far ahead, somewhere in the haze of morning, the German armor moved forward. The Thunderbolts flew in formation, silent except for the deep hum of engines and the occasional radio check. The wings glinted in the sunlight. The pilots watched each other carefully, maintaining their positions. They were 6 individuals, but in the air they moved like one body, one purpose, one goal. As they flew closer to the target area, the air seemed to grow heavier. The sky did not change, but something in the atmosphere felt different. The pilots sensed it. They knew they were getting closer to danger. Closer to the moment that would test their skill, their courage, and their ability to survive. Down below, fields stretched out across the land, calm and green. But within those fields were roads, and on those roads the tanks were coming. The German column was long, armored, and confident. Their engines growled like beasts. Their tracks crushed everything in their path. They did not expect an attack from above, certainly not one from only 6 planes. The Thunderbolts dropped lower, moving closer to the ground. The wind rushed faster across the cockpits. The landscape sharpened into clear shapes. Smoke trails became visible. Tire tracks in the dirt. Burned farms. Soldiers marching beside the tanks. A pilot swallowed hard. Another tightened his grip on the controls. They were trained for this, but training could never fully prepare someone for what they were about to do. Then finally they saw them. Tanks. Dozens of them. Dark shapes moving like a metal river across the countryside. The sun glinted off their armor. Dust clouds rose behind their tracks. Soldiers walked alongside them, rifles ready, unaware of what was approaching from the sky. For a moment the pilots felt something strange. It was awe, not admiration, but the awe one feels when standing before something powerful and dangerous. These tanks were symbols of destruction. They had destroyed towns, broken lines, and taken lives. And now 6 pilots were expected to stop them. The squadron leader's voice came through the radio again, quiet but steady. The message was simple. They would attack. The Thunderbolts spread out slightly, lining up for their first dive. Their wings carried heavy guns capable of firing more than 13,000 rounds per minute when combined. Their engines roared louder as they began their descent. The sky seemed to tilt. The ground rushed upward. The tanks grew larger in the pilots' sights. And in that moment, as gravity pulled them into their dive, the pilots felt something shift inside them. Fear mixed with focus. Doubt mixed with determination. They were outnumbered, but they were not helpless. They had their machines. They had their training. They had each other. The first pilot pressed the trigger. And the calm morning sky exploded into violence. A stream of fire burst from the Thunderbolt's wings, cutting through the air with deadly speed. The sound was like tearing metal and rolling thunder combined. Shells rained down onto the armored column. Sparks flew as bullets smashed into steel. Dust rose in huge clouds. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting orders across the field. More Thunderbolts followed, diving one after another. Their guns lit up the sky. Their engines growled with fierce energy. The peaceful morning was gone, replaced by the chaos of battle. From above the tanks looked strong. But the Thunderbolts were relentless. They struck from angles the tanks could not defend. They attacked the weak points, engine covers, fuel storage areas, exposed lines of soldiers. Every pass brought new damage, new fear, new confusion to the German forces. Still, the tanks did not remain helpless. Their guns turned upward. Their crews fired back. The sky filled with black puffs of smoke as anti-air shells exploded. Sharp metal fragments tore through the air. One hit a Thunderbolt's wing, leaving a deep scar. Another exploded near a cockpit, shaking a pilot to his core. The battle had only begun, and already the pilots understood the truth. This would not be easy. This would not be quick. This would not be safe. But they pressed on. Because they knew that what happened here today could change everything. The first attack run shook the entire battlefield. Dust swirled into the air as the Thunderbolts pulled up sharply, climbing back toward the sky to prepare for another strike. Below them, tanks burned in dark patches across the fields. Flames climbed through open hatches. Smoke rolled upward like black curtains rising into the morning light. But even with the damage they had caused, the pilots knew this fight was far from over. There were still many tanks moving forward. There were still soldiers firing upward. There were still dangers hidden in every corner of the battlefield. The squadron leader spoke again, calmly guiding the others. His voice carried strength even through the crackling radio. He told them to circle back. To stay low. To remain sharp. They had to keep control of the sky. They had to keep pressure on the armored column. The Thunderbolts curved through the air, their wings glinting in the sunlight. The sound of their engines echoed across the countryside. Birds fled from trees. Animals scattered. The land itself seemed to brace for what was coming next. The pilots lined up for another dive. This time the tanks were ready. They had spread out. They had taken positions behind ruined walls and clusters of trees. Their turrets turned quickly, tracking the shapes moving high above them. The soldiers below pointed rifles and machine guns toward the sky, firing bursts that left streaks of light before disappearing into smoke. As the Thunderbolts began their descent again, the world felt tighter. The air seemed thinner. The sound of gunfire reached them even before they fired their own weapons. They could hear bullets snapping past their wings. They could see the flashes of explosions rising dangerously close. The second pilot dove hard, pressing his plane toward the armored line. He fired again, sending long chains of bullets striking the tanks from the side. Sparks and pieces of metal flew in every direction. The tank crews inside shouted in confusion. Some abandoned their vehicles. Others stayed, trying to return fire with steady hands. The Thunderbolt pulled up sharply but not without damage. A piece of shrapnel struck the underside of the wing. The plane shook violently. For a moment the pilot lost control. His breath caught as the aircraft dropped lower than planned. Ground rushed toward him. But he fought the controls, using every ounce of training he had. The plane responded, climbing slowly, painfully back into the sky. He exhaled only when he saw the horizon again. Another pilot attacked from the far side of the column. His bullets tore into the supply trucks that followed the tanks. Fuel ignited instantly, causing a blast so powerful that even the Thunderbolt above felt the shockwave. A ball of fire expanded across the road. Soldiers ran, stumbling over each other as the flames chased them. Still the tanks pushed forward. They were built to survive. Built to roll across battlefields. Built to crush obstacles. 6 Thunderbolts alone could not stop them completely, not unless they found the perfect strategy, the perfect angle, the perfect moment. The squadron circled again. Their leader scanned the battlefield from above, searching for weaknesses. He noticed something important. The tanks were bunching together in certain areas where the ground was uneven. They were slowing down when moving across shallow ditches and soft soil. This created gaps in their formation, small windows where they were vulnerable. He shared his observation over the radio. The pilots responded with calm voices, each one ready to try something new. They had trained for many tactics. They had studied countless maps. But nothing compared to the challenge they faced right now in the middle of a real battlefield. They dove again. This time, the pilots aimed for the cluster of tanks moving across the soft soil. One Thunderbolt flew extremely low, almost close enough to touch the tops of the tanks. His guns roared loudly, shooting into the vulnerable rear armor. Bursts of fire spilled across the line. One tank exploded. Another lost its tracks and turned sharply before stopping completely. The other Thunderbolts followed, coordinating their attacks with precision. They struck from above, from the sides, and from directly behind. Each plane delivered a wave of fire so intense that the soldiers below were forced to scatter. But then something happened that none of the pilots expected. A hidden anti-air gun opened fire. It had been placed between 2 large trees. It was nearly invisible from the sky until it started shooting. The shells exploded close to the Thunderbolts, shaking the air with violent bursts. 2 planes were caught in the blast radius, their wings rocked sharply by the force. One of the pilots cried out in surprise as smoke began trailing from his engine. The explosion had damaged something inside. His plane was losing power. He adjusted his controls, fighting to keep the aircraft steady. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice stayed calm when he spoke through the radio. He said he could still fly. He said he was okay. But he wasn't safe. The squadron leader quickly changed the plan. They needed to get rid of that anti-air gun. Without doing that, every new attack run would be a risk they couldn't afford. 2 Thunderbolts broke away from the formation and turned toward the hidden threat. They flew in a tight curve, climbing just high enough to spot the gun between the trees. It was already preparing to fire again. The first Thunderbolt dove straight toward it. His bullets tore into the ground around the weapon. Dirt flew upward in long sprays. The soldiers operating the gun scrambled to take cover. The second pilot followed with perfect timing. His bullets hit the gun directly. It exploded in a bright flash, leaving only smoke and broken parts scattered across the forest floor. For a moment the sky was quiet again, but inside that silence was fear. Fear that another hidden gun was waiting. Fear that the next explosion might be too close to survive. Still, the mission continued. The Thunderbolts regrouped. Their formation was not as perfect as before. One plane trailed smoke. Another had holes in its wings. But they flew with determination. The kind of determination born from understanding that if they turned back now, the tanks on the ground would reach their destination. And if that happened, many lives could be lost. They checked their ammunition, their fuel, their damage. They listened to each other's voices on the radio. They took in the situation with sober minds. And then once more they prepared to attack. The sun had climbed higher now. The light was brighter. Shadows grew sharper across the battlefield. The tanks below cast long dark shapes that crawled slowly across the land like metal insects. The Thunderbolts lined up for their next dive. The air grew tense again. The world seemed to hold its breath. As they descended, the pilots saw something that changed everything. A large group of tanks had moved into a narrow valley between two hills. The valley slowed them down. It forced them into a tight line. They could not spread out. They could not maneuver easily. They were trapped, even if only for a moment. This was the opening the pilots needed. The squadron leader gave the order. The Thunderbolts spread out, creating a pattern in the sky. They would attack the valley from above, raining fire down on the tanks that had no space to escape. The first plane dove. His bullet struck the lead tank, ripping through the thin metal covering the engine. Flames burst through the rear. The tank stopped instantly, blocking the road. The second Thunderbolt fired at the tank behind it. Then the third. One after another, the planes made their passes. The tanks caught in the valley could not move. They could not turn their turrets quickly enough. They could not run. Explosions echoed through the hills. Smoke filled the narrow space. The ground shook as metal was torn apart. The valley became a trap, one the Thunderbolts used with deadly precision. For the first time since the mission began, the German armored column began to break. Tanks reversed. Trucks turned sharply. Soldiers ran in all directions. The tight line collapsed into chaos. But victory did not come easily. As the Thunderbolts pulled up from another dive, the damaged plane began to lose altitude. Its engine sputtered. Its propeller turned unevenly. The pilot inside struggled to keep it steady. He spoke through the radio again, this time with more effort. His voice was still calm, but beneath it, fear was growing. He said his engine was failing. He said he might not make it back. The others looked toward him from the sky. They could see the smoke. They could see the plane dropping lower little by little. And in that moment, a heavy silence filled the air. The battle continued below, but for the pilots, time seemed to slow. The mission was dangerous. They all knew this. But hearing one of their own talk like that, hearing the quiet acceptance in his voice, made the reality sharper. The squadron leader told him to head back toward friendly lines. He spoke firmly, refusing to let fear control the moment. The pilot agreed. He turned his wounded plane away from the battlefield, climbing gently, fighting gravity every second. The others watched until he disappeared behind a hill. Then they turned back to the mission. Because the fight was not over yet. And the tanks below were still moving. The battle in the valley had slowed the German advance, but it had not stopped it. Even with smoke rising from broken tanks and scattered soldiers running for cover, the armored column began to reorganize. New vehicles pushed forward. Officers shouted orders. Engines rumbled with renewed strength. The Germans were not ready to surrender the field. From above, the Thunderbolts circled like tired hawks watching a herd of wild animals that refused to collapse. The pilots looked down at the battlefield, trying to read the enemy's movements, trying to predict what would happen next. They felt the weight of time pressing against them. Their fuel was running lower with each passing minute. Their ammunition belts were getting lighter. Their engines were hot from repeated dives. Some planes were wounded. Some pilots were exhausted. But the tanks were still coming. The squadron leader spoke through the radio once again. He kept his voice steady and calm. He said they had to use their remaining strength wisely. They could not waste bullets. They could not waste fuel. Every attack had to count. The pilots understood. They adjusted their formation. They prepared for another run. As they moved into position, the battlefield below shifted again. The German tanks began spreading out, moving across open fields instead of staying close together. They were trying to make themselves harder to target. Some took cover behind hills. Others used abandoned houses or trees as shields. One tank fired its cannon at a distant point in the sky, missing the Thunderbolts by a wide margin. But the roar of the blast reminded the pilots that even armored vehicles could strike at them if they flew too low or too slow. The Thunderbolts descended with caution. They flew in pairs now, each one covering the other. They knew that if they stayed alone for too long they could become easy targets. The first pair aimed for a group of tanks near a row of broken farm buildings. The lead pilot fired his guns, sending bullets tearing through the roofs. Wooden beams shattered. Tiles exploded into dust. The tanks underneath were forced to move, exposing their weaker sides. The second pilot saw the opening and fired directly into the newly exposed armor. His bullet struck the tank's engine, causing it to burst into flames. The fire spread quickly, climbing into the sky in bright orange waves. The two Thunderbolts pulled up sharply, avoiding a burst of machine gun fire that chased them from the ground. On the other side of the battlefield, another pair of planes attacked from a different angle. They flew low, almost brushing the ground. Their bullets ripped through the tall grass, hitting soldiers who were running toward new positions. Trucks exploded. Ammunition crates burst into sparks. But with every pass the danger grew. The German forces were learning their tactics. They were aiming better. They were reacting faster. One Thunderbolt flew too low during a dive. A tank fired at just the right moment. The shell exploded close to the plane, tearing a piece from the tail. The entire aircraft shook violently. Alarms echoed inside the cockpit. The pilot fought the controls, trying to keep the machine steady. He breathed hard. Sweat ran down his face. The plane wobbled in the air like a wounded bird. Through the radio he said he could continue. He said he was still in the fight. His voice was tight but determined. The others trusted him. They had to trust each other. Without trust, the mission would fall apart. Meanwhile, the battlefield below was becoming harder to read. Smoke covered the land like a dark blanket. Small fires burned in patches across the fields. Explosions echoed through the hills. The smell of burning oil and metal reached even the pilots high above. The world felt smaller. The sky felt tighter. The land seemed to pull them downward with every turn. But in the middle of this chaos, the squadron leader noticed something important. Something hidden among the smoke and confusion. The German tanks were trying to regroup near a crossroads. It was a key point on the map. If they reached that place and broke through, they could move quickly toward their final objective. And if that happened, the Allied ground forces waiting miles away would be put in great danger. The crossroads had to be stopped. The Thunderbolts turned toward it. As they approached, they could see the German vehicles forming a defensive circle. Tanks pointed outward. Soldiers lay in trenches. Trucks were parked behind the armor, carrying supplies and ammunition. It was a strong position, carefully chosen. But it also created an opportunity. Because when tanks gather tightly together, even the smallest mistake can become a disaster. The squadron leader gave the order to attack the trucks first. The reason was simple: trucks carried fuel. And fuel could burn. The first pilot dove straight toward the line of vehicles. His bullet struck the nearest truck, piercing its fuel barrels. A moment later, the liquid inside caught fire. Flames erupted into the air. The second Thunderbolt followed quickly, hitting another truck. Flames grew into a massive wave that spread across the road. Soldiers ran for cover. Tanks tried to reverse, creating confusion among the crews. The fire spread faster than anyone expected. Fuel burned bright and hot. Smoke rose in thick columns. The defensive circle broke apart. The tanks were now exposed. But the Thunderbolts were nearly out of ammunition. They had one more chance. One more combined strike. One more push that could decide the entire mission. The planes flew higher to regroup. The pilots checked their weapons. Some had only a few bursts left. Others had slightly more. The squadron leader listened to each pilot's report. He formed a plan in seconds. They would attack together. All at once. A single coordinated strike. Every bullet aimed at the tanks trying to escape the burning crossroads. The sky grew quiet as the Thunderbolts lined up. The pilots took deep breaths. Then the squadron leader gave the signal. All 6 planes dove at the same time. The air screamed around them. Wind slammed against their cockpits. The ground rushed upward. The tanks grew larger in their sights. 6 streams of fire burst from the Thunderbolt's wings. Bullets rained down with blinding speed. Sparks flew off armored surfaces. Engines were hit. Tracks snapped. One tank spun sideways, sliding into another. A third tank tried to escape, but a burst of bullets struck its open hatch, forcing the crew to abandon it. The battlefield roared with sound. Metal cracked. Explosions flashed. Dust lifted into swirling storms. The Germans fought back, firing everything they had into the sky. But the Thunderbolts moved too quickly. They attacked from angles too sharp to predict. The combined strike worked. The tanks at the crossroads were forced to halt. Their lines broke once more. Their advance stalled completely. For the first time since the mission began, the German armored column stopped moving. The Thunderbolts pulled up, climbing into the sky with engines shaking from exhaustion. The pilots felt their hearts pounding against their chests. Their bodies trembled with adrenaline. They had pushed their planes to the limit. But the mission was not over yet. Smoke covered the land like a rising storm. Flames flickered in every direction. The battle below was still dangerous. Still unpredictable. The pilots circled slowly, trying to see what remained. The German forces were scattered, broken into smaller groups. Some tanks were still operational, but many were disabled. Soldiers were trying to find cover. Trucks were burning. The crossroads was covered in thick black smoke. But even in this chaos, the pilots knew they had done something important. Their attack had changed the enemy's momentum. It had created confusion. It had delayed the armored advance. But the price of this success was growing. Because as the Thunderbolts circled, the wounded plane, the one trailing smoke, began to lose altitude again. This time even faster. The pilot called out over the radio. His voice sounded weaker now, strained, tired. He said his engine was failing completely. He said the smoke was getting thicker. He said he could barely keep the aircraft level. The others turned their eyes toward him. They saw the plane dipping lower, wobbling, struggling. They felt the fear rise in their chests. They could not help him from the sky. He was alone. The wounded Thunderbolt dropped toward a field near the forest. The pilot searched desperately for a place to land. He saw a patch of open grass between 2 lines of trees. It was not perfect, but it was his only chance. He lowered his wheels. The plane shook violently. The engine sputtered and died. The aircraft glided silently. Then it hit the ground. The landing was rough. Dirt flew upward. The wings scraped the earth. The plane skidded, bounced once, and then slid to a stop near the edge of the forest. The radio went silent. The other pilots held their breath. Then, slowly, the wounded pilot's voice returned. Quiet but alive. He said he was okay. He said he had survived. Relief washed over the squadron. But they could not rest. Not yet. There were still tanks on the ground. Still enemy forces regrouping. Still danger everywhere. And the Thunderbolts, now only 5 in the sky, had to decide what to do next. The pilots took a moment to breathe as they circled above the burning crossroads. Below them, smoke rose in dark waves, twisting slowly into the sky. The air smelled of burning fuel and shattered metal, even at their altitude. The land looked like a battlefield torn apart by fire and fear. Yet the mission was still not finished. Even with one of their planes down, even with ammunition running low, even with their engines close to overheating, the 5 remaining Thunderbolts stayed in the sky. They looked down at the scattered tanks. Some were stopped. Some were burning. But others, still alive, were trying to move away from the ruined area. These survivors turned in different directions, looking for open ground. A few attempted to regroup. Others tried to hide in patches of forest or behind hills. The pilots knew that if even a small part of the armored column got through, the damage on the ground could still be great. The squadron leader studied the land carefully. His eyes scanned every corner of the battlefield. He saw the tanks trying to break away. He saw a few trucks still moving, their engines struggling through the smoke. He saw soldiers guiding vehicles toward a narrow dirt road that led deeper into the countryside. If they reached that road, they could disappear among the hills. And once they were out of sight, the Thunderbolts would not be able to stop them. The leader spoke into the radio, telling the others to prepare for a new attack. But this time they would not attack as a wide group spread across the sky. They were too few now for that. Instead, they would move together in a tight formation, concentrating their remaining strength on the vehicles trying to escape through the road. The Thunderbolts flew higher, climbing through layers of smoke until they reached clearer air. Then they turned sharply, forming a narrow line one behind another. Their engines hummed with heavy force. Their wings trembled slightly under the weight of the mission. The world below seemed to shrink as they looked down from above, waiting for the right moment. When they began their dive, the sky tilted again. The world rushed upward toward them in a blur of green fields, gray roads, and dark smoke. The air screamed past their cockpits. The smell of fuel filled their noses. Their hearts beat faster as they pushed their planes forward. The first Thunderbolt fired on the lead vehicle heading toward the road. The bullet struck the engine, causing it to burst into flames. The truck swerved wildly before stopping. The second Thunderbolt hit the next vehicle. Sparks flew from its metal frame as the bullets tore through it. The third plane followed, aiming for a tank trying to shield the others. The bullets hit the turret, forcing the crew inside to stop and take cover. The narrow road became blocked with burning wreckage. The soldiers still moving along it ran off into the fields, searching for safety. The tanks behind them struggled to turn around. The entire escape route collapsed into confusion. As the Thunderbolts pulled up again, they saw the effect of their attack. Vehicles were stuck. Tanks were trapped. The armored column's last chance of escaping the battlefield had been shut down. The pilots knew this was important, but the mission was far from over. For a few minutes, the sky grew quiet. The pilots circled high above the battlefield, watching the fire spread. They listened to the sound of their engines and the wind rushing past their aircraft. They checked their fuel gauges and the heat levels on their engines. They tried to catch their breath, even as the tension inside them stayed sharp. Then, far on the edge of the smoke, the squadron leader noticed movement. A group of tanks, still mostly untouched, had broken away from the main formation. They were moving toward a line of small hills, trying to reach cover before the Thunderbolts could strike again. If they made it into the hills, the pilots risked losing sight of them. And once lost, those tanks could regroup, attack elsewhere, or reinforce other German units. The Thunderbolts had to stop them. The squadron leader announced a new plan. They would split into two groups. 3 planes would strike from the front, blocking the tank's path. The other 2 would attack from the rear, cutting off any chance of turning back. The 5 planes separated smoothly, even though fatigue weighed on every pilot. Their hands were tired. Their eyes were strained from smoke and sunlight. Their ears rang from gunfire and radio static. Their minds were heavy from hours of flying and fighting. But they held on because the mission needed them to. As the first group approached the front of the tank line, the tanks began to fire upward again. Light bursts of smoke rose from their cannons. Shells exploded in the air, rocking the Thunderbolts with shockwaves. The pilots felt the pressure in their chests as they flew through the blasts, pushing forward despite the danger. The lead Thunderbolt fired first. His last belts of ammunition sprayed downward in a powerful line, striking the ground in front of the tanks. Dirt flew. Soldiers ducked. The tanks slowed, unsure of where the next attack would come from. The second and third planes followed with their own bursts. They struck the sides of the tanks, hitting their tracks, damaging their wheels, forcing them to stop moving. The tanks halted in a cluster, unable to continue forward. Meanwhile, the 2 planes attacking from behind swooped in with sharp precision. Their bullets tore through weak spots in the tank's armor. A few tanks caught fire. Others spun helplessly in place. Soldiers abandoned their vehicles and ran for shelter among the hills. The escape attempt failed. The tanks were trapped again. But the Thunderbolts were running out of strength. Their engines groaned under the stress. Their ammunition was almost gone. Their fuel was dwindling. They could not remain in the sky much longer. For the first time since the mission began, the squadron leaders started to consider that they might soon have to leave the battlefield. They had done more than anyone expected. They had stopped the armored column several times. They had destroyed many vehicles. They had broken the enemy's momentum. But they were only 5 planes now, and even the strongest machines had limits. The pilots listened as he explained the situation. No one wanted to leave. No one wanted to imagine what might happen if they were no longer there to stop the tanks. But they knew the truth. If they stayed too long, they risked losing their planes and their lives before reaching friendly ground. Still, before they could make any final decision, something unexpected happened. A distant rumble echoed across the sky. At first, the pilots thought it was thunder. The sound rolled slowly, deep and heavy. Then it grew louder, closer. It vibrated through their wings. The squadron leader turned his head, searching for the source. And then he saw them. Far away, just above the horizon, a second group of aircraft appeared. Their shapes were small but growing larger every second. They were flying fast. Their engines were strong. They were heading toward the battlefield. Reinforcements. A wave of relief passed through the Thunderbolt pilots. Help was coming. They were no longer alone in the sky. The new aircraft drew closer, and the pilots recognized them. More Thunderbolts from another squadron. They had been sent after military command received urgent reports about the tank column. The news had reached them late, but they had flown quickly. And now they were here. The 5 tired pilots felt a quiet strength return to their bodies. Knowing they were no longer alone lifted their spirits. Knowing other pilots would continue the mission gave them hope. The squadron leader quickly contacted the new group through the radio. He explained the situation on the ground. He told them which tanks had been destroyed, which were still moving, and where the remaining danger was. He warned them about hidden guns, dangerous valleys, and the smoke that covered parts of the land. The reinforcements listened carefully. They formed their own plan. They prepared to strike. With their arrival, the mission changed. The second squadron would take over the main attack. The first squadron, the 5 pilots who had been fighting since dawn, could finally begin their slow journey back to friendly territory. But leaving was not easy. The battlefield below was still filled with fire and smoke. The tanks still moved in small clusters. Soldiers still ran through the fields. The land still shook with explosions. The Thunderbolt pilots felt connected to the mission, as if the battlefield itself was holding on to them. Letting go felt strange. Yet they had to. Their fuel was low. Their ammunition was almost gone. Their engines were close to failing. The squadron leader gave the final order to head home. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of sadness in it, the kind of sadness that comes from knowing you must leave something unfinished, even when you've given everything you have. One by one, the Thunderbolts turned away from the battlefield. They flew over the hills, leaving the smoke behind them. The world slowly became quieter. The smell of fire faded. The air grew clearer. Yet the pilots could not shake the images from their minds, the tanks burning, the explosions rising, the fields torn apart. The weight of the mission stayed with them, pressing softly against their hearts. Ahead, the land opened into peaceful countryside. Rivers wound their way across the land like silver threads. Forests spread like dark blankets. The sky seemed calmer here, softer, kinder. It felt strange after hours of chaos. But even as the Thunderbolts left the battlefield, they knew the fight was not truly over. Reinforcements were beginning their attack. Soldiers on the ground were taking new positions. The war was still raging across Europe. And the mission they had just flown, the impossible mission of 6 Thunderbolts facing dozens of tanks, was now part of that larger story. As they flew toward safety, the pilots checked their instruments, their fuel, their engines. They adjusted their controls, listening to the soft hum of machinery. They thought of the wounded pilot who had crash-landed earlier. They hoped he was safe. They thought of the tanks they had stopped, the soldiers they had protected, the lines they had held back from collapse. And somewhere deep inside them, tired as they were, they felt something else too. A quiet understanding. They had changed something today. They had altered history in a small but powerful way. And soon the world would know what happened in the sky above that burning valley. As the 5 Thunderbolts began their long flight back toward friendly territory, a strange quiet settled inside each cockpit. The sky, once filled with fire and smoke, now opened into wide stretches of pale blue. The battlefield was behind them, hidden by distance and fading light. Yet the memory of it stayed sharp in their minds, like a scene carved in stone. The squadron leader checked on each pilot. One by one they answered with tired but steady voices. They were safe for now. Their planes were wounded, their bodies were exhausted, but they were alive. And every minute they flew away from the burning valley, the tension in their chests eased just a little more. Below them, the countryside looked peaceful again. Fields rolled gently across the land. Small farms dotted the hills. Rivers glimmered in the sunlight like thin silver threads. It was hard to believe that just a short distance away, fire still raged and metal still burned. War had a strange way of creating two worlds side by side. One filled with beauty, the other filled with destruction. The pilots felt the contrast deeply. Their hearts were heavy with the weight of what they had seen, but their eyes were grateful for the calm returning around them. Even so, the mission was not yet over in their minds. They kept thinking about the tanks still moving on the ground. They wondered how many were left. They wondered how long the reinforcements would need to finish the job. They wondered if the soldiers on the ground, the ones depending on them, were now safer because of what they had done. For a long time no one spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of engines, the soft whisper of wind brushing past the wings, and the occasional click of a pilot adjusting controls. The flight back felt longer than usual. Their bodies were tired. Their thoughts drifted between relief and worry. Then at last the radio came alive again. It was the reinforcements. Their voices were strong and confident, filled with energy the first squadron no longer had. They reported that the tanks were breaking apart further. Many were disabled. Others were retreating into the woods. The second wave was pushing hard and making progress. Hearing this, the Thunderbolt pilots relaxed a little. The job was being finished. The armored column would not reach its target. The lives they had hoped to save, the soldiers waiting miles away from the front, now had a fighting chance. The squadron leader thanked the reinforcements. His voice, though tired, carried a deep sense of pride. In the middle of war, teamwork mattered more than anything. And today, two squadrons, separated by distance and time, had become a single force fighting for the same goal. As the Thunderbolts drew closer to their home airfield, the view changed again. The dirt runway appeared between two long rows of trees. The airfield was small, surrounded by trucks, tents, and scattered buildings. Smoke rose from chimneys. Figures moved quickly along the ground, preparing for the arriving planes. The pilots lowered their landing gear. Their wheels shook as they extended into place. Their wings trembled slightly as the planes descended. Every landing felt like a small victory, especially after such a dangerous mission. The first plane touched down with a loud screech. The tires bounced once before gripping the dirt firmly. Dust rose in a wide cloud. Ground crew members ran forward, guiding the aircraft safely to a stop. The second plane landed moments later. Then the third. Then the fourth. The fifth plane had been damaged earlier, but the pilot still managed to guide it down carefully. The wheels hit the runway at an angle. The plane wobbled. But with a gentle pull on the controls, the pilot brought it back under control and let it roll slowly to the end of the strip. When the engines finally shut down, the silence felt almost unreal. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits slowly, their legs stiff, their arms shaking from hours of tension. The ground felt strange beneath their feet, solid and unmoving after so much time in the sky. Mechanics rushed forward immediately. They examined the bullet holes, the smoke trails, the cracked metal. Their faces grew serious as they understood just how close some of the planes had come to failing. But the pilots didn't focus on the damage. Instead, they looked around, searching for the man who had crash-landed earlier. They wanted to know if he had been rescued. They wanted to know if he was alive. And then they saw him. He stood near a jeep at the edge of the airfield, wrapped in a blanket, his face pale but smiling. A rescue team had brought him back safely. His plane was destroyed, but he had survived. The pilots walked to him, and their shoulders relaxed with relief. They laughed softly. They patted his back. They listened to him describe the landing, the rough ground, the shaking wings, the moment he thought the plane would flip over. He told the story calmly with small gestures of his hands. But the others could hear the deeper truth in his voice. He had been scared. Truly scared. Yet he had stayed in control. He had fought until the very last second. It was a reminder that courage did not always look loud or heroic. Sometimes courage was simply refusing to give up. As the pilots reunited, officers arrived to learn what had happened on the battlefield. The pilots explained everything. The valley trap, the burning crossroads, the tanks attempting to escape, the hidden guns, the reinforcements, the crash landing. They spoke with tired voices, but their words were steady. The officers took notes, but more importantly, they listened with respect. They saw the exhaustion in the pilots' eyes. They saw the dirt on their uniforms and the sweat on their faces. They understood that these young men had pushed themselves to the limit. When the reports were finished, the pilots were told to rest. But rest did not come easily. Their minds were full of images: bright fire, dark smoke, twisting metal, and the endless roar of engines. Even in the quiet of the airfield, the battle replayed in their thoughts. Some sat on the ground and stared at the sky. Others walked slowly among the planes, touching the damaged metal as if reading the story of the battle through the scars. One pilot found himself quietly whispering a thank you to his aircraft, the machine that had carried him through danger and brought him home alive. Later, as the sun began to set, the world grew softer. The golden light washed over the airfield, turning the aircraft into glowing silhouettes. The pilots watched the horizon. They saw the faint traces of smoke still drifting from the distant battlefield. Even from miles away, it reminded them of the fight they had left behind. But there was something else in the fading sky, something quieter and more peaceful. A sense of stillness, a sense of survival. A sense that, for tonight at least, the world was safer than it had been that morning. And so, slowly the pilots began to rest. They sat together near the tents. They shared simple food. They talked about small things, things that had nothing to do with war. They joked softly. They allowed themselves to breathe. The squadron leader watched them with a thoughtful expression. He knew what they had done today. He knew the risks they had taken. He knew the courage they had shown. And he also knew that tomorrow the war would continue. More missions. More danger. More battles waiting on the horizon. But tonight was not about tomorrow. Tonight was about surviving today. He looked at his pilots, these young men who had fought with everything they had, and he felt a deep sense of pride. Not the pride of victory. Not the pride of glory. But the quiet, honest pride of knowing that they had faced something impossible and refused to break. As the night grew darker, the air became cooler. Stars appeared in the sky, clear and sharp. The pilots looked up at them with tired eyes. In the silence of the night, the world felt wide and endless again. They thought of home, of family, of peace, of a future that felt far away, yet still worth fighting for. The wind moved softly across the field. The planes rested quietly on the ground. And the pilots, after a long day filled with danger and fire, finally allowed themselves to close their eyes. Sleep came slowly, but it came. And with it came a quiet understanding that tomorrow, when the sun rose again, they would fly once more. Not because they wanted war, but because they wanted peace. And peace sometimes needed people willing to face the storm. Morning returned slowly over the airfield. The first touch of light spread gently across the land, turning the runway pale silver and bringing soft shadows to the resting aircraft. The world felt calm, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm lay the weight of the mission they had flown the day before. The pilots woke with heavy eyes and tired muscles. Their bodies ached from hours of gripping controls, and their minds still held the sounds and images of the battlefield. Some pilots rose early. They stepped outside their tents and breathed in the cool morning air. The sky above them stretched wide and open, a clear reminder of where they had fought and survived. Others took a little longer, sitting quietly on the edges of their bunks, letting the memories settle. War had a way of leaving shadows in the mind, even after the danger passed. Soon the squadron gathered again near their planes. The ground crews were already working, checking engines, replacing damaged parts, cleaning oil and soot from metal surfaces. The pilots watched them move with focus and care. These men rarely flew into danger themselves, but they were part of every mission. Their hands held the lives of the pilots, and the pilots knew it well. When the squadron leader arrived, he carried new information. Military intelligence had been studying the results of yesterday's battle. The reports were clear. The mission flown by the 6 Thunderbolts had changed everything. The armored column had been stopped. The reinforcements that arrived later had finished the job, scattering the remaining tanks and forcing the German soldiers to retreat. Not a single enemy vehicle had reached its intended target. The pilots listened in silence. They felt relief, pride, and a quiet sadness all at the same time. They had succeeded. They had done what many thought impossible. But they had also seen things no one should have to see. They had risked their lives again and again. And one of them had nearly lost his. The leader continued speaking. He told them that the mission would be studied by commanders, used as an example of courage and strategic thinking. He said their names might appear in official reports, and their story might reach soldiers far from this small airfield. But the pilots didn't think about fame or recognition. They thought about the tanks burning in the valley. They thought about their planes shaking from explosions. They thought about their silent fear as the mission pushed them to their limits. After the briefing, the squadron gathered near the damaged plane that had crash-landed. Its body was broken, the wings bent, the engine destroyed. But the pilot who had flown it stood beside it, alive. He placed his hand on the metal and nodded softly, almost as if thanking the machine for giving its last breath to save him. The others stood around him, feeling the same quiet respect. They knew that machines were only metal and wires, but in battle, a pilot's life depended on every bolt, every joint, every piece of the aircraft. That bond was something only another pilot could understand. Later, as the sun rose higher, the airfield became busier. Trucks moved across the dirt. Mechanics carried tools. Officers walked with papers in hand. The war was still happening beyond the horizon, and more missions would come. But before the next day's tasks began, the pilots were given a small moment of rest. Some gathered under a tree near the edge of the airfield. They sat in the grass, letting the breeze pass over them. They talked quietly about home, about towns they missed, about meals they wished they could eat again, about people waiting for them far away. The stories made the world outside the war feel a little closer, a little more real. Others chose silence. They simply looked at the sky, their eyes following the slow movement of clouds. They had spent so many hours above the earth that the sky felt like a familiar companion. Up there they had faced death. Up there they had saved lives. Up there they had learned how strong, and how fragile, a human being could be. As the day progressed, an officer approached the squadron leader with new information. There would be a ceremony, a short one, held later that evening. It was meant to honor the pilots for their bravery during the mission. Medals would be presented. Words would be spoken. But the leader understood that no ceremony could fully express what had happened in the sky. Still, when evening arrived, the pilots stood together in formation. Their uniforms were clean, though still marked by the faint smell of fuel and metal. Officers stood before them, their hats straight, their expressions respectful. A small group of soldiers formed an audience, watching quietly. The officer spoke about courage, about strategy, about sacrifice. He described how 6 planes had faced dozens of tanks, how they had held back an entire column, how they had bought precious time for soldiers on the ground. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the airfield. But the pilots heard more in his words than what was spoken aloud. They heard the fear they had felt during their dives. They heard the roar of engines being pushed to their limits. They heard the crack of bullets striking metal. They heard the breathless moments when they were not sure they would survive. When the medals were presented, the pilots accepted them quietly. They nodded their thanks. They shook hands. But when the ceremony ended, they did not celebrate loudly. Instead, they returned to their tents, their planes, their quiet conversations. The medals were an honor, but the true reward was something else. The knowledge that they had done the right thing even when it was almost impossible. Later, after the sun had set and the stars returned, the pilots gathered once more near the airfield. The night was cool and gentle. Crickets chirped softly in the grass. The world felt calm again. The squadron leader spoke to them, not as a commander but as a fellow pilot. He told them that in war most battles were forgotten by the world, but a very few, became stories that lived on. The mission they had flown was one of those stories. Not because it was perfect, but because it showed what courage looked like. It showed what teamwork meant. It showed how determination could shape the future. The pilots listened quietly. Their faces were lit by the soft glow of nearby lamps. Their eyes reflected the memory of everything they had seen. And for a moment they all felt connected, to each other, to the mission, to the sky that had tested them. When the leader finished, no one spoke. Words felt too small. Instead, they looked once more at the horizon. They looked at the stars above them, bright and steady. They thought of the battlefield, of the burning tanks, of the roar of their own guns blazing in the valley. They thought of the wounded pilot who had survived. They thought of the soldiers on the ground who would live because 6 planes had refused to give up. Hours passed. The pilots slowly drifted back to their tents. The lamps dimmed. The air grew cooler. The sky grew brighter with stars. And as the world around them fell quiet, the deeper meaning of the mission began to take shape inside their minds. It was not just about tanks destroyed or targets hit. It was not even about medals or reports or the praise of commanders. It was about something more human. Something deeper. It was about the moment when courage rises not from strength, but from fear. It was about trusting others enough to fly into danger together. It was about believing that one small action, even from 6 planes, could change the direction of a much larger storm. When the pilots finally fell asleep that night, their dreams held a mixture of fire and light, fear and hope. They knew the war would not end tomorrow. They knew more missions would come. They knew danger would return. But they also knew something else. They knew that even in the darkest moments, ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights. They knew that history was not shaped only by grand armies or powerful leaders, but also by small groups of individuals who decided to stand firm when everything around them was falling apart. They knew that courage was not the absence of fear, it was the decision to act in spite of it. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of exhaustion and worry, a quiet truth began to grow. The mission where 6 Thunderbolts faced dozens of tanks was not just a moment in war. It was a reminder of what humans are capable of when they refuse to give up. It was a lesson about pushing forward when the world feels overwhelming. It was a story that would echo long after the smoke had faded and the tanks had rusted away. In time, people would tell this story. They would speak of 6 pilots who flew into danger without hesitation. They would speak of teamwork that turned fear into strength. They would speak of a mission that changed the battlefield, and perhaps even the course of the war. And as the night deepened over the quiet airfield, the stars above seemed to shimmer with the faintest whisper. Some moments in history are written not in books, but in courage. As days passed, the noise of the mission slowly faded from the airfield. New flights came and went. New battles took shape miles away. The war continued, always shifting, always demanding more from the men who lived inside it. But even as routine returned, something about the squadron had changed. The mission they had flown, the one that had pushed them to their limits, stayed alive in their hearts. The pilots still talked about ordinary things. They still laughed quietly. They still polished their boots and checked their gear every morning. But sometimes when the world grew quiet, their eyes drifted toward the horizon. They remembered the valley of smoke, the exploding trucks, the tanks scattered like broken pieces across the fields. And they remembered how close they had come to losing each other. Outside the war zone, the world would hear about the mission in a different way. Reports were written by officers. Maps were marked with symbols. Numbers were added to charts. Number of tanks destroyed, number of vehicles damaged, number of casualties prevented. To others it was data. To commanders it was strategy. But to the 6 pilots the story lived in their bones. They remembered the trembling wings. They remembered the feeling of pushing the control stick until their hands hurt. They remembered the smell of smoke inside the cockpit after each dive. They remembered the fear, not the loud kind but the quiet fear that sits deep in the chest and stays there until the danger passes. They remembered the mission not as something heroic, but as something human. One evening, long after the mission had ended, the squadron leader walked alone near the edge of the airfield. The sun was setting, filling the sky with soft reds and golds. The wind was gentle, brushing across the grass. Far in the distance, he could see the faint outline of hills, the same hills the tanks had tried to reach. He stopped walking and stood silently as the sky darkened. He remembered every detail. He remembered giving the order to attack. He remembered watching the tanks break apart. He remembered hearing the pilot's calm voice when he crash-landed. And in that quiet moment, he understood something he had not fully realized before. Courage was not about being fearless. Courage was about choosing to act when fear was strongest. The next day he shared this thought with the squadron, not as a lesson but as a reflection. The pilots listened closely. Some nodded in agreement. Some stayed silent, understanding the truth of the words in their own way. They had faced something impossible together. They had fought against numbers that did not favor them. They had seen danger up close, and yet they had continued. Their courage came not from strength alone but from trust. Trust in each other, trust in their machines, trust in their purpose. As the weeks passed, the story of the mission spread quietly through other units. Pilots from different squadrons asked about it. Soldiers spoke of it during meals. Mechanics told the tale while repairing engines. The story grew not because people wanted drama, but because it reminded them of something important. That even small groups, when determined, could change the direction of an entire battle. Sometimes, late at night, new pilots arriving at the airfield would stand beside the old, broken Thunderbolt, the one that had crash-landed in the field. They would run their hands along its damaged wings, imagining what it must have been like to guide a wounded plane to the ground while fire burned behind them and the battlefield roared beneath. The broken plane became more than a wreck. It became a lesson. A reminder that even machines could show the marks of bravery. A reminder that survival was never guaranteed. A reminder that sometimes, the most important victories came from holding on just long enough. Slowly, something else began to grow inside the squadron, a new sense of purpose. Their mission had not ended in the valley. It had become a part of them. It had taught them how fragile life could be. It had taught them how strong they could be when they stood together. And it had shown them that even in war, moments of humanity could shine through the smoke. One afternoon, while the pilots cleaned their gear, one of them looked up at the sky and said softly, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we didn't go?" The wind blew gently across the field. No one answered at first. Then the squadron leader replied, "Yes. But we did go. And that's what matters." The words settled over them like a warm blanket. They realized that the mission, dangerous as it was, had given them something rare, a chance to make a real difference. To protect lives. To hold back a force much larger than themselves. Not every pilot in the war would experience something like that. Not every mission would carry such weight. But theirs had. And the memory of that day would stay with them long after the war ended. Months passed. The seasons changed. The airfield saw new faces, new aircraft, new challenges. The war slowly began to shift in favor of the Allies. But whenever someone asked the squadron about the mission, they always told it the same way, not with loud voices or dramatic gestures but with quiet honesty. They spoke of the fear. They spoke of the teamwork. They spoke of the valley. They spoke of the moment when 6 planes dove together, their bullets flashing like lightning. They spoke of the burning crossroads. They spoke of the crash landing. They spoke of the reinforcements arriving just in time. But most of all, they spoke of the feeling that lived inside them in the final seconds of each dive, the feeling of choosing to face danger not because they wanted to, but because others needed them to. And in that way the story lived on. Years later, when the war was over and the world slowly rebuilt itself, the mission took on a new meaning. People wrote books. Historians collected papers. Old pilots shared memories with their families. Museums displayed rusted tank parts and pieces of aircraft. Children listened with wide eyes, imagining the roar of engines and the courage of the men who flew. Some of the pilots returned home and lived quiet lives. They worked in towns and cities. They raised families. They enjoyed the simple things they had missed during the war, the scent of baked bread, the sound of leaves in the wind, the warmth of a peaceful morning. Others stayed close to the military, training new pilots who would one day spread their wings in the open sky. These new pilots learned the rules, the strategies, the methods. But they also learned something deeper, that history was shaped not only by skill but by heart. Sometimes, during training flights, the older pilots would look at the younger ones and wonder if they would ever face a moment like the one they had lived through. A moment when numbers did not matter. A moment when teamwork meant everything. A moment when the world depended on a few brave souls refusing to turn back. No one hoped for such a moment. No one wished for it. But the older pilots knew that if it ever came, courage would rise again, just as it had in the Valley of Tanks. In time, the story of the 6 Thunderbolts became more than a memory. It became a symbol of resilience, unity, and the power of decisions made in the hardest moments. It became a lesson that people carried with them in different ways even outside of war. Teachers told the story to students to remind them that problems could be faced even when they felt overwhelming. Leaders told it to their teams to show how cooperation could overcome impossible odds. Parents told it to their children to teach them that bravery comes in many forms. And somewhere in the middle of these lessons, a deeper truth stood quietly. Courage is not something given. It is something chosen. When the pilots from the mission grew older, their memories softened around the edges, but the important parts stayed sharp. They could still feel the tension of that morning. They could still hear the sound of bullets hitting metal. They could still see the fire rising from the valley. And they could still feel the relief of returning home, seeing the airfield waiting for them. In their final years, when asked what they remembered most, they did not talk about the medals or the reports. They talked about each other, the men who flew beside them, the voices in their headphones, the hands that stayed steady during every dive. They talked about trust. Because in the end, that was what carried them through the battle. That was what kept them alive. That was what allowed them to face dozens of tanks with only 6 planes. Trust was their shield. Trust was their strength. And trust was the reason the mission succeeded. As time went on, the world changed again. New machines were built. New wars rose and fell. New pilots took to the skies. But the story remained. It lived in books, in museums, in memories passed down through generations. Even long after the last Thunderbolt had stopped flying, people still spoke of the mission. And when they told it, they did not speak of tanks and bullets alone. They spoke of courage, unity, sacrifice, and the quiet power of human will. They spoke of how 6 pilots faced something far greater than themselves, and did not look away. And so, as we end this journey through their story, we are left with a simple understanding. History is shaped by moments. Some are loud. Some are violent. Some are unforgettable. But a few, like the mission where 6 Thunderbolts faced dozens of tanks, remind us of something deeper. They remind us that bravery lives inside ordinary people. They remind us that unity can turn fear into strength. They remind us that even the smallest group, when standing together, can change the direction of the world. And they remind us that courage, once shown, never truly disappears. It becomes part of history, part of memory, part of who we are, forever.